The wind howled across the ice-covered planet, swirling the snow into thick, biting clouds that made it hard to see. The ground beneath was hard and unforgiving, like a frozen wasteland. In the distance, towering mountains of ice loomed, their sharp edges reflecting the pale, cold light of the twin moons above. A group of aliens, all from different planets, stood in a large circle, whispering among themselves. They had gathered for a unique event on this hostile planet. At the center of the circle stood a human, Alex. His breath came out in visible clouds, and his cheeks were already red from the cold. Despite the freezing temperature, he stood tall, eyes focused, ready to face whatever challenge lay ahead. He had been chosen to represent humanity in this survival contest, where humans were said to be weak and helpless compared to the other species of the galaxy. The aliens around him sneered and whispered. They didn't think a human could survive this harsh planet. After all, the professor who had organized the event was a renowned alien scientist, one who had traveled to many planets and studied countless species. He believed humans were fragile, too soft to handle the dangers of deep space. One of the aliens, the professor, stepped forward. He was tall and thin, with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. He wore a long, silver cloak that glittered in the cold light. He raised his hand, and the crowd grew silent. "Welcome," the professor said in a voice that echoed through the snowy wasteland. "Today, we witness the ultimate test. This planet is harsh, unforgiving, and cold. The question is, can a human survive it?" He looked down at Alex, who stood with determination in his eyes. "This human believes he can, but I say he cannot. No human could survive here without proper technology, without the warmth of fire, or the safety of shelter. So I propose this challenge to you." The professor's eyes gleamed as he spoke. "Alex," he said, turning to the human, "you will prove your strength today. The task is simple, but it will show us if you are truly as capable as you believe." Alex straightened up, ignoring the biting cold that stung his face. He was used to hard work. He had lived through challenges before, and this would be no different. The professor raised his hand again, pointing toward the frozen wasteland. "Your task is to build an igloo. You must complete it within 10 minutes. It must be strong enough to protect you from the wind, or you will fail. If you cannot, you will be proving me right that humans cannot survive on this planet." A murmur ran through the alien crowd. Some of them laughed quietly, while others exchanged looks of doubt. They all knew how impossible this task was. The wind was strong enough to freeze even the toughest creatures, and the cold was unbearable without proper clothing and shelter. No one, not even the strongest alien, could survive without proper preparation. They thought Alex was doomed to fail. The professor's voice cut through the murmurs. "You have 10 minutes, human. Start when you're ready." Alex took a deep breath. The cold air stung his lungs, but he wasn't going to back down. He had faced worse challenges before. He could do this. He would do this. The professor and the aliens around him might have their doubts, but Alex had something they didn't understand: the will to survive. He looked around. The snow stretched out in all directions, the ice glittering in the pale light. There was no shelter, no help, and no warmth. Just the freezing wind and the brutal cold. The countdown had begun. 10 minutes. He couldn't waste a second. The professor stood back, arms folded, a smug smile on his face. He had seen many species come and go, but humans, he had no faith in them. He believed that no human could ever survive this planet without the right tools and equipment. "Let's see how long this one lasts," he muttered to himself, watching as Alex began to gather the ice blocks from the ground. The first few steps were awkward for Alex. The ice was hard, slippery, and heavy. He had no idea how to build an igloo, but he was determined to figure it out. He bent down, lifting a large block of ice, feeling the cold seep into his fingers. He dragged it across the snow and stacked it carefully, one block at a time. Each move was slow, and the cold made it hard to think clearly. But Alex pushed through. He couldn't stop now. The aliens watched with growing disbelief as Alex continued. He was working faster than they had expected, and the igloo was beginning to take shape. It was clear that Alex wasn't giving up, no matter how impossible the task seemed. And with each block of ice he stacked, the professor's smile began to fade. The cold, the ice, the mocking whispers of the aliens, it all faded into the background as Alex focused on one thing: finishing the igloo before the time ran out. The clock was ticking, and he wasn't going to let the professor's challenge break him. The wind howled louder, as if the planet itself was mocking the humans who had gathered. The snow swirled in the air, biting at anyone who stood outside. Alex could feel the icy cold on his skin, his breath coming out in sharp puffs. The air felt like needles, and every step he took was harder than the last. The chill in his bones made it seem impossible to do anything, let alone survive a challenge on this brutal planet. But he didn't show it. Around him, the aliens stood huddled together, their eyes cold and calculating. The professor, the one who had come up with the challenge, stood apart from the crowd, his tall figure casting a long shadow in the dim light. He had already spoken, telling everyone that humans were weak, that they would never be able to survive on this planet. Alex knew that. He knew what they all thought about humans. But there was one thing they didn't know. Alex wasn't going to give up. He wasn't the strongest human, but he was strong enough to stand up for his kind. The professor's challenge seemed impossible. 10 minutes to build an igloo in a frozen wasteland. It was a test no one could pass, especially not without the right tools or help. The aliens all knew it. They all believed that Alex would fail. But then, Alex stepped forward. "I'll do it," he said, his voice clear and loud enough to be heard above the wind. The words hung in the air for a moment. There was silence, then the sound of whispers. The aliens looked at each other, some raising their eyebrows, others smiling with amusement. But no one stepped forward to challenge him. They had already made their judgment. They were sure he would fail. The professor's eyes sparkled with smug satisfaction. "Very well," the professor said, his voice colder than the wind's. "You've made your choice, human. You will prove to all of us that you cannot survive. 10 minutes is all you have to build something that will protect you from the cold. Fail, and you'll show us just how weak you truly are." Alex didn't flinch at the professor's words. His heart raced, not from fear, but from the thought of what this moment meant. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for humanity. He was fighting to show the universe that humans were more than what aliens believed, that they were stronger, tougher, and more resourceful than anyone gave them credit for. He took a deep breath and looked around. The wind stung his face, but he didn't care. He could feel the cold deep in his bones, but that didn't matter either. He had made up his mind. He was going to do this, no matter what. The professor made a show of raising his hand and pointing toward the barren, ice-covered land. "Your task is simple," he said. "Build an igloo that will survive the freezing winds. If you fail, you will show everyone just how weak your species really is." Alex looked at the barren, snow-covered ground, the endless ice stretching out before him. There was no shelter, no warmth, just the fierce winds that would freeze anyone who wasn't prepared. It felt impossible. It was impossible. But Alex knew something the professor didn't. Humans were survivors. They could adapt, overcome, and find a way when it seemed like there was no hope. The countdown began. 10 minutes, the professor said, his voice like ice. "Begin." Without wasting another second, Alex moved quickly toward the closest patch of snow. His breath was coming faster now, but he pushed through it. He had no idea how to build an igloo, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. He had watched documentaries about survival. He had read books on building shelters, and though he didn't have the proper tools, he knew what he needed to do. He knelt down, his hands freezing as he gripped the first block of ice. It was heavy, too heavy for one person to carry, but he knew he had to try. He dragged it across the snow, his fingers stiff from the cold. The professor and the aliens watched in silence, their eyes narrowed with disbelief. Alex didn't care. He wasn't worried about the aliens watching. He was focused only on one thing: survival. With every movement, his muscles screamed in protest, but he pushed through. His hands were numb, and he could feel the cold seeping into his bones, but he kept going. He didn't stop. He wouldn't stop. The aliens were still watching, murmuring among themselves. They thought he was insane. They thought he didn't stand a chance. But Alex didn't care what they thought. The only thing that mattered was finishing the task, proving them wrong. The professor, standing a few feet away, watched with a mix of amusement and curiosity. He had seen many species fail, seen them collapse in the face of harsh conditions. He was sure Alex wouldn't last, but something about the human's determination made him pause. He crossed his arms, his cold smile still in place. "Let's see how long you last, human," the professor muttered under his breath. Alex didn't hear him. He was already moving on to the next block of ice. He could feel the cold nipping at his skin, the wind pulling at his clothes, but none of it mattered. All that mattered was that he finished the igloo. He would prove to the professor, and to all the aliens watching, that humanity was stronger than they thought. The cold wind cut through the air like sharp knives. Alex could feel the chill biting at his skin, and his breath turned to ice with every exhale. The snow around him looked like a never-ending sea of white, and the mountains of ice in the distance made the entire place feel endless. It was hard to focus with the wind howling and the freezing cold creeping into his bones. But Alex didn't care. The challenge had begun. He bent down and grabbed the first block of ice, his fingers numb as they gripped the hard surface. The block was heavy, too heavy for him to carry easily, but Alex wasn't about to give up. He dragged the ice across the ground, his boots scraping against the snow as he moved. Each step was harder than the last, but he kept going. The time on the countdown clock was ticking away, and every second felt like it was slipping through his fingers. The professor stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching Alex closely. A smug smile was still on his face. He knew humans were weak. He had seen many creatures struggle to survive in these conditions, and he was certain Alex would fail. After all, how could a human survive in this place without proper tools or training? The professor's eyes gleamed with confidence, his cold smile never fading. Alex didn't look at the professor. He didn't care what the aliens thought. They were watching him, waiting for him to fail. But Alex's focus was on one thing: building the igloo. The clock was ticking, and he had no time to waste. He dragged the block of ice into place, trying to make the base strong enough to hold the rest of the structure. It wasn't easy. The block was heavy, and his fingers felt like they were going to freeze off. He had never built an igloo before, but he knew that if he didn't get the base right, the whole thing would collapse. His hands ached from the cold, but he didn't stop. He moved to grab the next block of ice, bending down and lifting it with all the strength he could muster. The snow made it harder to see, and the wind made his eyes water. But Alex kept his head down and kept working. The alien crowd was silent now, watching closely. They had expected him to quit by now. They had expected him to fail. But Alex wasn't quitting. As the wind howled around him, Alex paused for a moment. He looked around at the snow-covered land. There was nothing here, no shelter, no protection. The icy winds whipped at him, and the freezing cold was everywhere. But even with all of that, he couldn't give up. The challenge wasn't just about surviving the cold. It was about proving to these aliens that humans could do things they never thought possible. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. It was hard to think clearly with the cold seeping into his brain, but he knew he had to keep going. The igloo needed to be strong. It needed to stand up to the wind and the cold. He had to make it work, no matter what. The aliens stood around him, watching in silence. They were starting to look uncertain. They had expected Alex to fail by now, but he was still working. Slowly, he started stacking the ice blocks, one on top of the other. They weren't perfectly shaped, and they weren't perfectly aligned, but they would have to do. He was running out of time. The professor watched with a raised eyebrow, his smirk fading a little. He hadn't expected Alex to make it this far. He had thought the human would freeze or collapse from exhaustion long before he had a chance to build anything. But Alex wasn't stopping. The professor's confident expression was starting to waver. The clock kept ticking, and Alex's muscles screamed for rest. His hands were stiff, and his legs felt like lead. Every breath was a struggle against the cold, but he didn't stop. The igloo was starting to take shape, and he was getting closer. The alien crowd was starting to murmur among themselves. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. No one had expected a human to be able to do this, not in these conditions. Alex was pushing himself beyond his limits, working faster and harder than anyone had thought possible. He was making it happen, step by step. The wind picked up again, howling like a wild animal, but Alex didn't flinch. He was determined to finish. His mind was focused entirely on the igloo, on getting the walls up before the time ran out. He knew that if he failed now, it would be over. He would be proving the professor right. But if he finished the igloo, he would show the aliens that humans were stronger, tougher, and more resourceful than they had ever imagined. The blocks of ice started to form the shape of a dome, each one fitting into place just right. It wasn't perfect, but it was solid. The professor was watching closely now, his arms no longer crossed, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. Alex had made more progress than he had expected. He couldn't believe it. Alex moved faster now, his body aching but his mind sharp. He could feel the eyes of the aliens on him, but he didn't let them distract him. There was only one thing he cared about: finishing the igloo before the time ran out. The clock showed only a few minutes left. Alex was almost there. The igloo was almost finished. The wind howled like a wild animal, tearing through the snow and biting at Alex's skin. His breath was coming out in thick clouds, disappearing into the freezing air. The cold was so intense that every part of his body felt frozen. His fingers were numb, his legs stiff, and his whole body seemed to be shutting down. But Alex refused to stop. He couldn't stop. The clock was ticking down. Only a few minutes left. He could feel the pressure building with every second, and his muscles were begging him to stop. But he knew he couldn't. Not now. Not after everything he had done to get this far. If he gave up now, it would be like proving the professor and all the aliens right. It would be like admitting that humans weren't strong enough to survive on this ice-cold planet. Alex took a deep breath, his chest aching from the cold. His hands were stiff, and it was getting harder to lift the blocks of ice. The snow was deep, and each movement felt like a struggle. Every time he picked up an ice block, it seemed heavier than the last. His arms felt like they were made of stone, and his legs were shaking beneath him. But Alex didn't stop. The igloo was almost finished. He could see it now, the rough shape of it rising from the snow. It wasn't perfect, but it was strong enough to protect him from the wind. He just had to finish the last part, the dome. Once the dome was in place, it would be done. But time was running out. The countdown clock showed only a few minutes left. The professor and the aliens were all watching, their eyes fixed on Alex. They were waiting for him to fail. They were waiting for him to collapse under the cold, to give in to the pressure. But Alex wasn't going to let that happen. He bent down and grabbed another block of ice, feeling the cold seep into his fingers. The wind picked up again, tearing at his clothes, but Alex didn't let it distract him. He dragged the block of ice into place, gritting his teeth as he struggled to keep his balance. His legs wobbled, and his breath was shallow. But he didn't stop. The professor's voice echoed in the distance, cutting through the storm. "You're wasting time, human," he called. "You'll never finish. This is hopeless." But Alex didn't listen. The professor's words were nothing but noise in the wind. He had heard enough of their doubts. He had heard enough of their sneers. The only thing that mattered now was finishing the igloo. He moved quickly, lifting another block of ice and placing it on top of the last. The dome was starting to take shape. It wasn't perfect. There were gaps in places, and some of the blocks weren't perfectly aligned, but it was strong. It would protect him from the wind. The cold was unbearable now. Alex's fingers were so numb that he couldn't feel them anymore. His legs were shaking, and his body felt like it was made of ice. He could barely keep his balance as he moved around the igloo, but he kept going. His heart pounded in his chest, and his muscles screamed for him to stop, but he pushed through the pain. He could see the time ticking away in his mind. Every second felt like an eternity. The wind was deafening, and the cold was unbearable, but he didn't let it stop him. He couldn't. The professor and the alien stood in silence, watching with a mix of disbelief and amusement. They had expected Alex to collapse by now, to fail. But he hadn't. The igloo was nearly done. He was still working, despite everything. The cold, the exhaustion, the wind. The aliens began to murmur among themselves. Some of them were starting to look uneasy, unsure of what was happening. Alex didn't notice the whispers. He didn't care about the aliens. He only cared about finishing the igloo before time ran out. He grabbed another block of ice and placed it on top, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The dome was nearly complete. His body was telling him to stop, but Alex refused to listen. He couldn't stop. The igloo needed to be finished. The wind was freezing, but the igloo would protect him. He just had to finish it. The last block of ice went into place with a grunt of effort. The dome was done. It wasn't perfect, but it was strong. It was enough. The igloo stood tall, its walls solid, and the dome holding strong against the wind. Alex stepped back, his legs shaking, his whole body aching with exhaustion. He could barely keep his eyes open, but he had done it. The igloo was finished. The task that had seemed impossible was done. The professor stood in silence, his smug smile fading. The aliens were staring, their expressions a mix of surprise and disbelief. They had expected Alex to fail. They had expected him to freeze, to collapse, to prove that humans were weak. But Alex had done it. He had built the igloo, and he had proven that humans were capable of things they never imagined. The clock had run out. The challenge was over. And Alex had won. The wind howled louder than ever, as if the very planet was angry. Alex stood in front of the igloo, his chest heaving with exhaustion. His body was shaking from the cold, his legs barely able to hold him up. His fingers were numb, and his whole body felt like it was made of ice. But he couldn't stop. Not now. The countdown clock had reached its final moments. Only a few seconds left. Alex turned his head slightly, glancing toward the professor. The aliens stood in a circle, their eyes locked on him, waiting for him to fail, waiting for him to collapse into the snow and prove that humans were no match for this icy planet. But Alex wasn't going to fail. Not today. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold bite at his lungs. It was hard to think, hard to focus with the wind rushing past him. But he knew this was the moment that mattered. The final test. The professor had said that Alex couldn't survive this planet, that humans were weak. But Alex wasn't about to prove him right. The igloo was complete. The walls were solid. The dome held strong. It wasn't perfect, but it would protect him. It had to. The countdown continued. The seconds ticked by slowly, like each one was taking a lifetime. 5, 4, 3. The professor's voice rang out, calm and cold. Alex's heart pounded in his chest. Every part of him screamed in pain, but he stood tall, holding his ground. The wind whipped around him, pushing at his clothes, biting at his exposed skin, but he didn't move. He didn't flinch. 2, 1. The professor's voice was cold, like ice. He looked down at his watch, eyes glittering with the expectation of victory. The clock hit 0. Alex held his breath for a moment. the world around him feeling like it had paused. The snow, the wind, the aliens, all of it seemed to freeze in that moment. But then, a strange thing happened. The professor's smug smile started to fade. The aliens looked at each other, their eyes filled with uncertainty. Alex's gaze never wavered. He didn't need to say anything. The igloo was standing. The walls hadn't collapsed. The dome hadn't fallen. He had done it. The professor stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he examined the igloo. He had expected it to be a pile of ice by now, to be nothing more than a failed attempt. But instead, it was standing. Strong. Defiant. Impossible, the professor muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. You should have failed. But Alex didn't hear him. He was too focused on the task he had completed. The wind was still raging, and the cold was still unbearable. But he knew something the professor didn't. Humans could survive. Humans could adapt. And humans could do things others thought impossible. The aliens remained silent, watching in disbelief. They had come to the planet with the expectation of seeing the human fail. They had believed the professor's words, that no human could survive in this freezing wasteland. But Alex had proven them wrong. Alex finally took a step toward the igloo, his legs trembling beneath him. Every movement was slow, deliberate. The cold had drained all the strength from his body, but he didn't care. He was so close to the shelter, so close to the warmth it would bring. His mind felt foggy, his thoughts clouded by exhaustion, but he pressed on. He reached the entrance of the igloo and ducked inside, pulling himself into the small space. The air inside was still cold, but it was a world away from the freezing winds outside. Alex leaned against the wall of the igloo, his back stiff, his legs aching. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the quiet of the shelter wash over him. Outside, the aliens were still standing in a circle, their eyes fixed on the igloo. They were beginning to speak in hushed tones, murmuring among themselves, but their voices lacked the confidence they had had before. They were starting to realize something they hadn't believed before. Humans were stronger than they had thought. The professor stood at the center of the group, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. He had been so sure that Alex would fail, but now he wasn't so certain. He had seen humans survive before, but he had never seen one push through so much, so far. He had underestimated them, underestimated Alex. The countdown had finished, but the test wasn't over yet. The professor was still watching, still waiting for something to happen, still expecting failure. But what if Alex had succeeded? What if the humans weren't as weak as he thought? Inside the igloo, Alex finally allowed himself to relax. The pressure, the cold, the struggle, it was all fading now. His breath slowed, his body easing into the warmth of the shelter. But his mind remained alert. He had completed the challenge, and the hardest part was over. The wind outside could howl all it wanted, but inside the igloo, he was safe. And outside, the professor and the aliens were beginning to realize that Alex had done what they thought was impossible. They were starting to understand that, no matter what they believed, humans could survive. Humans could thrive. The countdown had ended, but the real lesson was just beginning. Inside the igloo, Alex sat with his back against the icy wall, breathing slowly. The air was still cold, but it felt warmer than the freezing wind outside. His body ached with exhaustion, and his fingers felt like they were made of stone. But the pain didn't matter. He had made it. The igloo was complete, and he had survived the challenge. Outside, the professor and the aliens were still standing, staring at the igloo. They hadn't moved for what felt like forever. Alex could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't care. He had proven them wrong. He had built the igloo, and he had survived. The professor finally spoke, his voice cutting through the silence. You've built your shelter, human, but the test is not over yet. Alex's heart skipped a beat. He had hoped so badly, that the challenge was done. But the professor's words made it clear. It wasn't over. Not yet. Alex stood up slowly, his legs still weak from the cold. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the way his body screamed in protest. There was no turning back now. The countdown had ended, and the Igloo was standing, but there was one last test to face, and he would face it, no matter what. Outside, the aliens were still watching. Their eyes were filled with curiosity, but there was a hint of doubt there too. They had expected Alex to fail. They had expected the Igloo to collapse, to fall apart in the harsh wind, but it hadn't. And now, they were waiting for the next part of the test. The professor looked at Alex, his eyes sharp and calculating. "You think you've succeeded?" he asked, his voice cold. "You think you've beaten the cold? We'll see. There's still more to prove." Alex didn't answer. He couldn't. He had no idea what the professor meant, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to back down. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to give up now. The professor raised his hand and pointed toward the horizon. "That mountain," he said, his finger cutting through the snowy landscape. "It's where you need to go. It's the next part of the challenge. Make your way to the top, and you will have completed the test." Alex followed the professor's gaze, his eyes narrowing. The mountain was massive, towering above the snow-covered land. It looked impossible to climb, especially with the cold and the wind pushing against him. But Alex wasn't afraid. He had already done the impossible. He had built the Igloo, and he had survived the freezing winds. Climbing a mountain, that was nothing. He took a deep breath, preparing himself for what came next. The professor and the aliens were still watching, waiting for him to fail, waiting for him to turn back. But Alex wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. He stepped out of the Igloo, the cold immediately rushing back to bite at his skin. The wind howled louder, the snow swirling around him. But Alex kept moving. He didn't stop. His legs were still weak, but he pushed through the pain. He had climbed mountains before, though none quite as tall as this one. Still, he was used to challenges. He knew how to survive. Each step was hard, the snow deep, and the wind pushing against him. But he kept going. The mountain was steep, its peak disappearing into the clouds, but Alex wasn't about to back down. He couldn't. He had come so far already, and he wasn't going to let the professor or the aliens see him fail. The professor's voice echoed in the wind. "Keep going, human. You've come this far, but the mountain will test you in ways you can't imagine." Alex didn't respond. He didn't need to. The professor's words were just more noise in the wind. What mattered now was reaching the top, proving once and for all that he was strong enough to survive. The snow made it difficult to climb, but Alex was determined. He pushed through, his muscles aching, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The cold was overwhelming, and the wind was merciless, but he kept climbing. He couldn't stop. Not now. The mountain seemed to grow taller with each step, but Alex was focused. He knew what he had to do. He had to reach the top. That was the only thing that mattered. The wind howled louder as he climbed, pushing against him with all its force. It felt like the mountain was fighting him, but Alex wasn't going to give up. He gritted his teeth and continued to climb. His legs were burning, and his breath felt like ice in his chest. But he didn't stop. He was almost there. The top of the mountain was so close now. Just a few more steps, and he would be done. He would have proven that humans could survive, that humans could do the impossible. With a final push, Alex reached the top of the mountain. His legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the snow, gasping for air. The cold bit at his skin, but it didn't matter. He had done it. He had reached the top. The professor and the aliens were still watching, their faces unreadable. But Alex didn't care. He had completed the challenge. He had faced the cold, the wind, the mountain, and he had won. He looked out over the snowy landscape, the wind still howling around him. But he felt a sense of triumph. He had made it, and no one, not even the professor, could take that away from him. The wind howled louder than ever as Alex stood at the top of the mountain, his chest heaving with exhaustion. His legs were trembling, his body aching from the cold, but he had done it. He had climbed the mountain, proving that humans could survive and conquer the impossible. Alex looked down at the professor and the aliens. They were still standing at the base of the mountain, staring up at him with disbelief. The smug expressions on their faces had faded, replaced with shock and confusion. They hadn't expected Alex to make it this far. They hadn't expected him to reach the top. The professor stood with his arms crossed, his eyes locked on Alex. "You've made it," he said, his voice colder than the wind. "But it's not enough. You may have reached the top, but the test isn't over. Not yet." Alex didn't respond. He was too tired to argue, too tired to care about anything else. He had done what they thought was impossible. He had built the igloo, he had climbed the mountain, and now he was standing at the top. That was enough. That was victory. But the professor wasn't finished. He walked forward, his face hard and serious. "You may have completed the physical challenges," he said, "but there's one more thing you need to prove. You need to survive the cold. You need to stay alive out here, in the wilderness, without shelter, without help." Alex's eyes narrowed. The professor was pushing him again, trying to make him fail, but Alex wasn't going to let him win. He had already proven that humans were strong. He had already shown them that he could survive, that he could adapt. "I don't need to prove anything to you," Alex said, his voice firm despite his exhaustion. "I've survived. I've beaten the cold. I've done what you said was impossible." The professor stared at him for a long moment, his eyes full of calculation. "You've done well, human," he said finally. "But this test isn't about what you can do. It's about what you can survive. The cold will push you to your limits. It will make you question everything. Can you survive it? Can you stay alive when your body begs you to stop?" Alex took a deep breath, his mind clear despite the cold and exhaustion. He could feel the biting wind against his skin, but it didn't matter. He had already proven everything. The professor didn't understand. He didn't understand that humans didn't give up. Not when it mattered. Not when there was something worth fighting for. Alex took a step forward, toward the professor, his face set in determination. The professor flinched slightly but didn't step back. He stood his ground, expecting Alex to collapse or fall. But Alex didn't fall. He didn't give in. "I've done it," Alex said again, his voice unwavering. "I've proven that humans can survive this planet. I've built the shelter, I've climbed the mountain, and I'm still standing. You thought we were weak, but you were wrong." The professor's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Alex saw a flicker of doubt in his gaze. He hadn't expected Alex to be so strong, so determined. He had expected him to fail, to break under the pressure. But Alex had done the impossible. And now the professor could no longer deny it. "You think you've won," the professor said, his voice filled with frustration. "This test was never about whether or not you could survive. It was about proving the limits of human strength. You've done well, but the cold will never stop. It will always come for you. It will always try to break you." Alex didn't flinch. He stood tall, facing the professor with a calmness that only came from knowing he had already won. "I've already proven that I can handle the cold," Alex said. "I've already faced it, and I'm still here." The professor was silent for a moment, his mind racing as he tried to find a way to argue, a way to take back control of the situation. But it was too late. Alex had won. The professor had underestimated him, and now there was no turning back. The aliens stood behind the professor, their faces a mix of surprise and confusion. They had watched the entire challenge, expecting Alex to fail, expecting him to freeze or collapse. But he hadn't. He had done everything they said was impossible. And now they had to face the truth. The professor's shoulders slumped, his eyes finally meeting Alex's without the cold arrogance that had once filled them. "You've won," he said quietly, his voice filled with reluctant respect. You've proven that humans are stronger than I thought. I was wrong." Alex nodded, the weight of the words settling over him. He had done it. He had proven that humans could survive in the most impossible conditions. He had shown them that humans could adapt, overcome, and thrive in the face of challenges that would break others. As the professor stood there, defeated, Alex felt a wave of relief wash over him. The challenge was over. The professor had been proven wrong, and the aliens had seen the strength of humanity. It was a victory, not just for Alex, but for all humans. He turned to the professor one last time. "This isn't just about surviving," Alex said. "It's about showing that we don't give up. No matter how hard it gets, no matter what, we keep going. That's what makes us human." The professor didn't respond. He simply turned away, leaving Alex to stand alone at the top of the mountain, victorious. The wind howled, the snow swirled around him, but Alex didn't care. He had already proven what he needed to prove. The professor's defeat was final, and humanity had won.